Ooh, angel eyes, you are so good to me. And when I'm in your eyes, you be so heavenly. You know I love you, my little angel eyes. We are here preparing for Stevie Van Zandt on Outside In. Stay tuned. Hello Microsoft, and welcome to another edition of Outside In. My name is Diego, and I am an inspiration seeker at Microsoft. I like to nurture my own sense of wonder, and I like to share it with others, with you. Today, I get the great pleasure and honor to interview someone who also is an inspiration seeker and has inspired me and countless others. His name is Stevie Van Zandt. Some of you may know him because he's a rock and roll Hall of Famer with the E Street Band. Some of you may know him because he's an accomplished actor from The Sopranos and Lilyhammer. But he's much more than that. He's a producer, he's a show creator, he's a political activist, he's a radio DJ, a radio station owner, a record label owner, many other things as well. And he's an author. He's here today with us to show us his new book. It's called Unrequited Infatuations. I read it, I liked it, and we're going to talk about it today. So without further ado, welcome, Stevie.
Hi. Ciao, Diego. How you doing, baby?
I'm so excited. I mean, the more I read about you, like you're a very interesting person, Stevie. So I took some notes from the book, and I would love to just to talk about some of the chapters. Is that okay?
Yeah. Go, baby, go.
Excellent. So I want to start with something that comes very clear in the book, which is your love for music. Like, I love music, I play guitar, but it's your love of music is so real, so palpable. Your respect for the craft, for the people who make it. And it all started when you were 10. You tell the story, you were 10 years old, because you talk about a lot of epiphanies that you had. But I think the most important one was the first one. You were 10 in your room listening to a record, Pretty Little Angel Eyes, which is a song that is now stuck in my head forever. So thank you very much. And you realize that music has the power to save the world. And I think, like, I see like your whole life kind of goes from that premise. So I just wanted to ask you about your love for music, what music means to you.
Well, I mean, it was the way I began my life. You know, I think we all are seeking our path, you know, and our identity and where we fit in. You know, and I wanted to write a book that was more universal than just about music. But that is certainly how my life began, for sure. I could not really relate to what society was offering at the time. I couldn't really fit in anywhere. And so music really literally saved my life. And very good timing. You know, my generation was the luckiest generation, for sure. Growing up in the 60s, you know, growing up in a Renaissance period. And I refer to it as a Renaissance because when the greatest art being made is also the most commercial, you are in a Renaissance. And that only happens every couple of 100 years. And I was very lucky to grow up in that incredible atmosphere of the 60s when there was just excitement in the air every day. In spite of all of the crazy things going on, you know, that were not so positive. I mean, the assassinations, Vietnam, you know, we had the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and all kinds of conflicts and problems, but yet we looked forward to every day. We knew every day was going to be better than today, you know. Tomorrow's going to be better than today, every single day. So we had an optimism that I miss, you know. I miss that, and I miss the magic in the air that the music provided back then. So the last 20 years or so, I've been dedicating myself to making sure this endangered species of rock and roll and soul music as well, stays alive and stays accessible for future generations, because I think it will continue to be inspirational for anyone who hears it.
Among other things, I'm sure you're referring to, so you have a foundation called TeachRock.org, which is actually using music to teach history, and it's empowering teachers all across the nation to use them as a curricula. I went there and I took a couple of classes. There was one, I took cumbia. There were some Colombian women teaching cumbia, but I also took the one about the Asbury Park, where you tell about the story of that park and the music played there and New Jersey. And yeah, I think it's very powerful. So kudos on that. And for the folks watching, Stevie is actually donating a signed guitar that we did a sweepstakes to raise money, and the winner will be announced after this interview. So thank you for that, for the guitar.
My pleasure.
We got to talk about the Beatles, because I'm a huge Beatles fan. I have pictures of him on the wall. And but I think I've never met a bigger Beatles fan until I read the book. You truly call that Ed Sullivan Show a big bang. What I like about the book is that you reference songs and shows and everything you can go find on YouTube. So as I was reading the book, I would go listen to the song, and I would, but the moment, so you're a funny guy, so you had me laughing. I was laughing out loud, but in the last page, you really got me. I teared up, because you talk about what the Ed Sullivan Show meant to you when the Beatles appeared. And I don't want to spoil the ending, but I'm going to a little bit. Like at the end, you tell about when Paul McCartney joined you on stage on your band, and you tell that story. And I started crying, because you really explain what it meant to you. So could you talk about that moment and the whole Beatles thing?
It's a little bit hard to explain to people who are used to bands being, all over the place, and music being so accessible in terms of the internet, But if we can just imagine a time when there was no internet, no cell phones, no video games, and it was a very quiet sort of time. We had, 3 channels on TV, and good radio, very good radio, always. And we had just had President Kennedy was just assassinated on my 13th birthday. And just a month later, a couple of months later, we started to hear this music of the Beatles, and then we would see them February 9th, 1964, and it was the beginning of what we called the British invasion, because after the Beatles came 10 other fantastic bands, but we had never seen a band before, so it was very, very a new experience to see 4 or 5 guys singing and playing. I know that sounds, like dinosaurs age or something, but if you went to your high school dance, there was an instrumental group playing, So it was still unusual to see people singing and playing at the same time, And they were so alien and so foreign and so literally like a spaceship had landed from another planet, because their hair was different and perfect, and their entire style was new to us, and it really was the beginning of my generation relating to entertainers who were around our own age. They were just 5-6 years older, I guess, than most of us. So it was and they so impressed our culture that suddenly bands became the thing, and everybody had a band, and I mean, most of them mercifully stayed in the garage, but about a dozen of us got out there into a circuit, but it became the thing to do. I mean, occasionally you would go to a drive-in movie, because drive-ins was the thing back then, But maybe you go to a movie once in a while, but other than that, you were either going to see a band or you were in a band playing, So that was everything. That was 100% of of our culture's entertainment in those days, you know. So very, very different world than this one with so many distractions and so many things to do now, you know. That was everything. So that was all came from the Beatles. They led the way, and for me, they were a little too perfect and a little too sophisticated to really be able to say, "Geez, I think I can do that," you know, because we only were introduced to them about halfway through their career. They were already together since '57. They were gone in '69. And so by the time we discovered them, they were incredibly good. You know, the harmony was perfect. The songs were incredible, you know. And it was just 4 months later that the Rolling Stones came. And I always tie the two bands together because the Rolling Stones looked more casual. They made it look easier than it was. You know, they dressed whatever they felt like. Their hair was not perfect, really, you know, except for Brian Jones. And, you know, no harmony, really, you know. It was like the first punk band, you know. Yeah. And so the way I like to put it is the Beatles really introduced an entirely new world to us, and the Rolling Stones invited us in.
I love that. I love that. You tell the story the moment Paul shows to your show, and you're hoping he will come in, and you prepare your band just in case, and then you go out and say hi to him, but you say, look, you work too hard, so today, don't even think about coming on stage today. Yeah. But inside, you really wanted him to come in, so I thought that was hilarious. It worked out like that. I wanted to talk to you about, so at Microsoft, we have this concept called the growth mindset. We're trying to base our company culture on this idea that we can always keep growing. We are lifelong learners. It's not so much about what you know, but how much you want to learn. And I think you are a lifelong learner because you didn't stay with music. You did all these other things, you know, like in terms of producing and acting. A lot of it was about empowering others. Like I know that one of the reasons you made your radio station, which has over 1,000 episodes, is to be a platform for bands, rock bands that wouldn't get an opportunity otherwise. So I'm just curious, like, how do you see yourself as a lifelong learner? Do you believe in saying yes to opportunities more than no?
Yes, life, of course, is one long learning experience. I mean, I am luckier than most because I got an entirely new craft handed to me, and in fact, several new crafts by David Chase. I was in my 40s, you know, an entirely new craft of acting, and I turned that into 4 new crafts, you know. For Lilyhammer, I was one of the writers and producers, and did the music, and I ended up directing the final episode. Yeah. So, you know, you never stop learning, and you know, and you never stop, you know, seeking. My life is it's really all about greatness. You know, I seek it out, I support it when I find it, and I try to achieve it. You know, I try to create it when I can. Everything else to me is a waste of time. You know, that's the only thing I fear in life is wasting time. And the challenge, I think, for this generation is the fact that greatness isn't born. You know, right, nobody is born great. You know, you have to develop it. It has to be developed, and that takes time. And that is not wasting time. That is using time with good purpose, you know. And I'm always trying to encourage people to live with purpose, you know. But you must have the patience that this society. You have to fight. You have to fight this present day society to have the patience to develop. You know, everything is instant gratification now. Yeah. And nothing great is done that way, you know. So you know,
like the good news is that with time and enthusiasm, you can accomplish almost anything. But the bad news is, like, without that, you cannot do anything. Yeah, you need time. Great things take time and enthusiasm, you know.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, but you know, to do that these days, you have to shut the world off. You have to make it. You have to actively, you know, aggressively shut, you know, your phone off, or shut the computer off, or you know, whatever it takes, you know, to actually focus on something that's important, because it's only that focus that's going to allow it to evolve. You know.
Yeah.
And it's a very it's a challenge, and I don't envy this generation, because you have to fight it every single minute of the day. You know, I mean, I notice it myself. You know, you're looking at your phone every 60 seconds. If you're not actively doing something, you know, you keep looking at the phone. And it's an addiction. And there's no doubt.
It is literally an addiction, meaning it's literally, like people look at the brain, it is literally an addiction, same chemicals as with the other addictive substances, and you get withdrawal syndrome. You take a phone away from a kid and they suffer physical pain.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I panic myself. You know, if I can't find my phone, I'm like, there's a little bit of momentary panic. You know, that's me. You know, for whom this is it's a new device. You know, for me.
Yeah,
I mean, I spent most of my life without one. You know, and didn't need it either. You know, but it's an incredible addiction. So. It's a really tough, I think, challenge for kids now to, you know, and teachers. You know, that's why we, you know, half of what we do with our teaching method is focus on. It's not for us. It's not so much, you know, teaching kids, you know, what to think. It's all about teaching kids how to think. You know, that's the important part, and that comes from integrating the arts into the disciplines, changing STEM to STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and math, putting in the A of STEAM of the arts into that.
Totally.
And when you blend the arts into the other disciplines, an entirely different part of your brain starts to understand those disciplines, you know? And I think that's the future of education myself, you know? And
I agree. That's the magic, integrating those two. And in the book you talk about, so first you mentioned David Chase and the new craft, and I actually, so I want to talk, so you give stories of luck and serendipity, but also about determination and perseverance. So on the luck and serendipity part, you tell the story of you were giving the speech to induct the Rascals to the Hall of Fame, and you always found the speeches were a little bit serious, so you decided you wanted to make it funny. Folks can go watch it on YouTube. It's hilarious. I was laughing out loud, seriously. And I think it's the first time that you did that kind of like over-the-top Italian thing, you know, and you talk about how David Chase just happened to be watching, and you were speaking kind of like Silvio Dante style. And so that was, and you talk about like there were like 10, 15 coincidences that need to happen for you to land on soprano. So that is luck and coincidence. But on the other hand, when you created your radio station, you sent letters to 350 different radio stations, and you got all rejections, ignored, and you didn't give up. So for the folks watching, like, how much of his life is life, perseverance, both? Like, what's your take on that?
Well, that's that's the question, huh? That's the question, really. I mean, my life is really not a good example, because my life is a little bit crazier than most, I think. Half the time I'm planning on something and working on something over here, and my life comes in the side door or the back door, you know. I think it helps to be ready, you know, to try and prepare yourself for life, whatever you know, whatever cards you're dealt, you know, whatever destiny has in mind. You know, I know it's not exactly a precise way to help somebody, but. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know where the type of security that I have comes from. I think it's probably from a very early age, you know, receiving a lot of love from my family that provides that kind of, you know, inner confidence, you know, in you, that allows you to be flexible, allows you to, you know, kind of take life as it comes, you know, because I think And that's not to say, we should sit around and wait for life to happen. Okay, the opposite. It's the opposite. You have to actively be doing something in order for destiny to find you. It's
right, exactly.
So I mean, for me, it's been a lot of serendipity, a lot of crazy things, circumstantial. But when the circumstance happens, I recognize it and I jump on it. You know what I mean? I'm like, okay, that's where I'm going. Okay, now David Chase wants me to be an actor. Yeah. Okay, I'll be an actor. And I learn about it. I learn about that craft and study it and jump in 100%.
Yeah, you use the word destiny quite a bit. You talk about destiny. So first of all, you talk about one thing that kind of broke my heart, and I really want to challenge you on this, because you talk about how you think like destiny was for you to stay with the E Street Band, but you walked out. And then you talk about how destiny called again with Lillehammer when some random people from Norway showed up, and you were not going to cheat destiny again. But do you really regret leaving the band when you made it? Because you keep talking about that, but it's just I feel bad for you, because you shouldn't regret. Like, look at all the goodness that happened.
I know, and I think I'm quite clear about saying that everything I have accomplished since I left the band. Yeah. So, I mean, the way I think I really put it is, I wish I could have done both. I wish I could have stayed and yet done, my solo records and done the Sopranos and Lillehammer and brought down the South African government. And it's a constant. It's a little bit of a. It's a little bit of a, paradox, a little bit of a,
Exactly.
It is what it is.
Because you talk about in the book that you said you are a cautionary tale of beware of leaving your power base. Like, don't stray off too far from your power. What do you mean by that? Like, tell me more.
No, there is some wisdom occasionally in the book, because. I try to pass along what I've learned, that was for me the reason to write the book, I mean, not so much my narrative, which is the least interesting part to me, but, I wanted to have, the history that I witnessed in there. I wanted to have the crafts that I've learned about, little bits and pieces of wisdom that I picked up along the way. And certainly one of them is never leave your power base until you have another one to go to. That is for sure. If you're lucky enough to have a power base in the first place, and in the entertainment world, it's a little bit more complicated than business. But in the entertainment world, you have to find an audience, or the audience has to find you. And in my case, I was very lucky. First of all, with the E Street Band, we succeeded with that. Then I was, most of the time, once an audience defines you, that's it. You're done for life. I was lucky enough to have an entirely second life as an actor, and be completely accepted by an audience again. So that was. Two.
That's how I met you. I first met you to the Sopranos.
Yeah. And so I'm luckier than most already, just by having an audience redefine me twice. But after that, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. When it comes to me being an artist, a musical artist, and I don't regret anything I did artistically. I really am quite proud of my work, but. Asking an audience to redefine me in the musical sense, after they liked me being Bruce's, consigliere, or best friend, they never did really accept me as an artist on my own, and so, and that's just, I'm not complaining about it. Or whining about it because I'm the luckiest guy in the world, But it is a little frustrating, and that's, really where the title of the book comes from. The things that you really put your heart and soul into, have not been quite as, commercially successful as you would like. So it limits your ability to do more creative thing.
So don't forget your like once you find that platform, don't give it for granted. Don't like make sure you take care of that platform. Yeah.
Right.
And you talk about friendship, and first of all, I say this, I mean it. It clearly comes across that you are a good friend. Like you helped a lot of friends that you didn't get credit for during those 7 years walking the dog. You talk about how after you left the East Bank, you spent 7 years walking the dog. But you also talk about how you like the dynamic you saw between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, and then you kind of model that for you and Bruce, and later you modeled that dynamic for Silvio Dante and Jimmy Gandolfini's character.
Yes.
So in Microsoft, we're really trying to make this transition of empowering others. Like the mission of Microsoft is to empower people to achieve more. So I see you started as a front man. So yeah, you were the leader of the band, and you purposely switched to what you call the underboss. So in a sense, you were empowering these other folks. So like, what's your take on friendship, empowering others? Like,
well, first of all, I realized very young that if I'm going to have friends, I have to define the friendship. I have to let them define the friendship. It has to be defined on their terms, because I am a bit extreme in almost everything I do, which I don't recommend. But I'm quite extreme when it comes to friendship, and I realized very early no one else thinks that way. So I have to define the friendship according to how they're comfortable, Secondly, I learned that even though I started off as a front man, and then when I returned to being a front man in the 80s, I got quite good at it. I was quite a good front man.
Yeah.
But that's never been my natural inclination. But after the first few years, I realized I don't really need the spotlight. I don't, and you have to need it to be a great front man.
You talk about that. You talk about frontmans have a hole they need to fill.
Yeah, I really feel that. Yeah. I feel that's true. And like I say, the same thing that made me confident as a kid and all through my life, that love you get when you're 5 years old, I think also extends to this, to this sort of thing. So I enjoy much more being behind the scenes, being the producer. I see myself as a producer, writer. That's my main identity, if I have to identify myself, The performer part of my life is the fun part, And I know it sounds like I don't take it for granted at all, but the truth is, performing is a vacation for me, whether it's being an actor or being a rock star or whatever, that stuff, you walk on stage and you're having fun, man. That's wonderful,
Sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to let you know, it shows. Like, I watched your Super Bowl halftime show. I watched you with Paul McCartney. I love seeing you and Bruce play Glory Days. When you go like, oh yeah, all right, oh yeah. Like, you're having fun. Like, you're having fun. Almost like a victory lap, literally. It shows. Like, it's very inspiring to see you have fun like that.
Yeah, and but is that my most satisfying work of my life? No. It's the fun part. It's the vacation. It's, people think, oh, you're going to work, you're going on tour now, you're going to work. Right. I'm like, no, I go to work the minute I come off the stage, But
it's good for you to demystify. It's good to demystify this, because people see the glamour and they think it's all fun, but there is like the actual work, to challenge yourself and grow.
The work for me, the realizing of my potential is in creation, writing, creating something from nothing. And that means writing, and that means producing. That's where I get my most satisfaction, and everybody's different, but that's for me is the real work, and the performance part, which is the part that people know about and see and respond to. Yeah, that's wonderful. If you can make people happy. Great! What a wonderful way to make a living, is to making people happy. How can you beat that? But
totally,
but behind the scenes, it's the creative stuff
Yeah.
that matters most to me.
And I'm smiling because in your book you tell this story. You can see these things. For example, Lillehammer, how you had to go fly to Hollywood, broker a deal, go back, negotiate, renegotiate. Like or the Sun City, we're going to talk about that. Like you put a lot of these projects on your shoulders, and you were the actual quarterback making it all happen. Like people don't know these things, so that's why I recommend the book. We got to talk about political activism. You define yourself as a political rocker, and I didn't know the extent of the impact of the Sun City, the boycott over there, the musical boycott. And for people who don't know, who might be younger, Stevie organized like this Artists United against the apartheid in South Africa, and he organized a song that started with a few friends, but ended up with like 50 A-listers. So I wrote here, you had Bono, Peter Gabriel, Ringo Starr, Miles Davis, Bruce Springsteen, Keith Richards, Joey Ramone, many more people. You can also look it up online. And it accelerated the end of the apartheid, accelerated freeing Nelson Mandela. I heard you say that's one of the things your biggest accomplishment. You've been doing activism all your life. You did this other record called Voice of America, and you even have a song called Los Desaparecidos. Talks about Argentina. That's where I come from. I come from Argentina. And you talk about the people disappearing in Latin America. So again, where does that drive, that care come from? Is that who you are? Is that something you were born with? Did you nurture it?
No, I am. I think it comes from. It's not something you're born with, but I think very young. My mother remarried when I was 7, and my stepfather, the only father I've ever known, was an ex-Marine Goldwater Republican. Okay, and his generation was America, love it or leave it, right or wrong, America, the government is always right, and so they had that kind of, sort of blind faith, patriotism is how. To this day, a lot of what's left of the real Republican Party, which very little left of the real Republican Party, because I know all about it because I was in a household with a Goldwater Republican, so I know the entire history of conservatism. But I think instilled in me was a love and a true patriotism of America. Now, my definition of patriotism and my father's, we started to go separate ways, because my generation was the one who started questioning the government, which I feel is the obligation of a true patriot, And so I think that came from my father, that love of the country. And in my case, I love the country, but I feel like we are an experiment that is not finished yet. We still have work to do to realize the ideals of the more enlightened founding fathers that we had. Let's not kid ourselves. We were founded, by male-dominating, white supremacist, Christian extremist nationalists. Supporting an oligarchy, So that whole thing we're trying to fix. We've been trying to fix.
I love that.
Ever since.
I love that you even said that at some point you felt you had to write a song called "I Am Patriot."
That's right.
Because you wanted to this. Your definition of patriot is, we need to do whatever it takes to really do the best for the nation. And sometimes that is to challenge the status quo. We're seeing so much happening right now. In corporate America, we're seeing a lot of activism, This is something that Microsoft is trying to embrace, It
has changed. You have to adapt to what's going on, But I was never a fan of the party system, I don't believe it works. Now we're seeing the extreme. We no longer have 2 functioning parties in America. That's for sure. When one of the parties no longer believes in democracy or equality or science, we got a real problem going on now. And, and the only way it's going to be fixed is if every single Republican is voted out of office in 2022. We'll see about that. But that aside, I've always felt that and that's part of the I Am a Patriot song, is saying that, party affiliation is not what this is all about. Whatever football team you're on, it's about the ideals of America and realizing true democracy and true equality and believing in things like science and so I had to say it. I had to say it out loud because I knew, the word patriot has been co-opted, by extreme.
It's kind of been hijacked. It has been hijacked now.
Yeah. And I have an ongoing war with my friends at Sirius Satellite who have the conservative station called Patriot Radio. I'm like, this is criminal.
Well, for those of you who want to see, Stevie is still fighting the good fight on Twitter every day. You can follow him on Twitter. He's very vocal about everything that happens. He can't help himself. But also in the book, you tell the story about, I love that, he's like, hey, one day I hitting it big with the E Street Band, and a month later I was hiding in the back of a taxi trying to cross some border in South Africa to talk to some guerrilla leaders who had guns. So it's very hilarious. And I think it's probably more normal than you think, that sometimes we have this calling, we can't continue doing what we're doing because physically we have this need to do something else, and I love that you're being vulnerable with that.
Yeah, again, you have to be a little bit flexible in life, but that doesn't take anything away from learning craft. Craft, it's all about craft, Learn something. The more craft is its own reward. If you get good at something, I don't care what it is, carpentry or an iron worker or a taxi driver, limo driver, I don't care what it is, If you get really, really good at it, it's its own reward. And you're able to...
There's implicit value,
gives you, and it gives you the self-confidence to deal with life as it comes at you, because it comes at you, from so many directions,
That is the ticket. So I guess my last question before we start closing is... I heard you say, so we talk about the need of the front men, that they have a need for admiration. I struggle with that personally. I've been making the transition to be more someone that supports others, empowers others versus me, because of the same things that you talk about childhood. You gave this advice. I love that someone asked you for advice. And you said, if you need advice, you're not going to make it in the business. And I think that I interpret it in a very good way, that at some point you need to have that light from within, right? Believing in yourself. Can you tell me more about that journey for those of us who need it,
it's a little bit harsh, but it's a tough love, people always come up to you, my son's a guitar player, what can we tell him? What advice can you give him? And, the truth is, if you need advice, you're not going to make it, because you have to be compelled. You have to be self-sustaining and compelled to do something in this world, or else it's not going to happen. I mean, nobody encouraged me. Nobody encouraged Bruce Springsteen. Nobody, okay? We were considered this, 1 inch away from being criminals. The rock and roll wasn't even a business until the 70s, And before that, you were just a freak, that needed psychiatric help, as far as the society was concerned, So we were the opposite of encouraged, but that's why we bonded as friends. We bonded as friends based on that. At least there's one other guy that's a freak like me. So, at least there's 2 of us, you know what I mean? Who believe that rock and roll is everything. Not just something on the weekend, not a hobby, not some kind of, no, not temporary. There was no plan B for me and him. you know?
Right.
And that's how you make it. You make it when you have no other choice, when you have no other options, you know? That's, you know, in the entertainment world anyway, that's, you have to be compelled, I think, you know, to do it.
I love that. Like, have a mission and commit to it, you know?
Yeah, man, and it doesn't matter.
Listen to the input, but don't lose your center where you're after.
Oh yeah, no. Input is important, you know, always. You know,
Yeah.
you can listen to anybody, but you know, but when I really wanted to do something, I ignore everybody, you know, and to my own, you know, peril sometimes, you know. I mean, but you know, they said, you know, you just came out of the biggest TV show maybe in history, the most respected TV show. You're going to go do a little show, a local show in Norway. You know, are you out of your mind? You know, I just felt, you know, if I have control of it, just enough control of it, I can make it work. And I couldn't resist the adventure.
Just when they thought I was out, they pull me back in.
Of starring in a foreign country's local TV show.
Right.
I never heard of anybody doing that, you know? Who does that?
You understand how beautiful it is? Like, you expose so many people to that culture. I love episode 1 when your character is arriving and finds like a fish wrapped in a newspaper and thinks like, oh shit, like they found me. And he was like the neighbor who dropped the groceries or something, you know, like I just, but the whole culture, how they live. And I think, you know, you talked about in America, like the way we're workaholics in compared to Europe, you know, like you found that difference. And I think you exposed us here to some of that culture of that little town, you know, and so it's good.
That was the idea, you know. The two creators of the show said, you know, Norway had never sold a show ever to anybody, you know, and they said, how can we do this show and make it more, you know, universal, you know? And I said, well, it just so happens I know exactly how to do that because I saw it happen twice in my life. You know, I saw New Jersey become fashionable twice. You know, try that one. You know, and the way to do it is to, you know, you want to be international, then be as personal and local as you can be.
Right.
You know, show every eccentricity, every little nuance of Norwegian life. It was particularly effective in Norway because nobody knows anything about Norway. Nobody, okay? You can't name one celebrity, you can't name one product. You know, half the people in America think Norway's a city in Sweden, you know. I mean, you know, so anything we said at all was new information, but I made them really dig deep down to come up with the craziest little Norwegian eccentricities because I knew that's going to make it more universal because people are curious, man. You know, people want to learn about things that they don't know, you know.
And when we talk about diversity and inclusion and making the world a better place, it starts with proximity, getting close to things, you know, like when you understand, and you talk about music, one of the music was ahead of its time in terms of like segregation, like there was segregation, but the music is where those things didn't matter, you know.
That's right.
So I think the arts can play that role. It's a bit ahead.
Yes, it was the beginning, you know. I think we still, you know, as I talk about, you know, the very last chapter of the book, I didn't talk about too much politics in the book. You know, I kept it, I threw in a few things in the last chapter just to stimulate some conversation. But I have an entire political book half written already, so I might.
No. You actually throw a whole political like proposal actually, which I loved. You talk about, okay, here are all the topics, and here's my recommendation to the president. I thought it was very good.
Well, I mean, you know, certain basic things, you know, like integration, which has never happened in our country. You know, I'm like, you know. When are we going to invite our black brothers and sisters to join the rest of us in America? When?
Yeah.
How much longer do we have to wait before we invite them into America? Because the biggest scam, the biggest scam ever perpetrated on the black culture was by the white culture was convincing them that the black neighborhoods was their idea. You know, that the hood is a black cultural phenomenon. You know,
Right.
I mean, that's you know, that's got to change, and until that changes, You know, I've been listening to our reforms, you know, for 50 years. You know, yeah, we're going to fix up the hood. You know, we're going to get better policing, better education, better this, better this, better that. You know, it's bull. You know, the only way to fix the hood is to get rid of the hood. You know, and that's a whole nother conversation that we don't have time for.
No, but you also like blacks, also Native Americans had it pretty rough in this country, and you actually also during your world tour to learn about all these injustices, you also went to very tribal nations, and you learned about that too, and wrote about that too. So
yes, and to this day, our political prisoner Leonard Peltier still in jail. I'm on my sixth president trying to get him out of jail. Okay, he was completely framed and unjustly imprisoned for 45 years now. You know, he's our Nelson Mandela in a way. You know, still in jail. Six presidents I've been trying to get him out of jail, which is our one of our most embarrassing and horrific miscarriages of justice in our history, and so that still goes on. You know.
Hey Stevie, before we wrap up, I just want to give you one last time the microphone for anything you want to say. We have 130,000 employees at Microsoft. Very motivated people. So anything you want to tell them about political activism, about pursuing their passions, about arts, about your organization, TeachRock.org, anything like these are technologies, like all generations. Any last words for them before we say bye?
I think all I can say is when it comes to your children, look into TeachRock.org. You know, we have to start integrating the arts into the education process. Every single part of the education process, every grade level, every discipline, and it changes the way that kids understand the education process, and it's the future. And eventually, we want to be the one class that brings kids to school. You know, we still have the biggest embarrassing dropout rate, in the world, and if kids like one single class, they'll come to school. Well, we want to be that class. And so, I mean, I want to emphasize, the importance of the arts. And I think it carries right into the Microsoft sensibility because, I think you guys are conscious of combining business with art, art with commerce, the business methodology with certain artistic sensibility. I think that the combination is what makes our country unique, and we need to re-emphasize that integration of the arts into our technologies.
Science and art integrated. It's a beautiful thing.
That's what makes us special. Really, if you look around the world, nobody does that better than us. Nobody combines science and the arts together better than us. And we need to emphasize that even more and have it taught from kindergarten on up. And then we're gonna really start evolving again because I think our species has temporarily stopped evolving, and we need to get back to evolution here, and that comes from within, and that's where the arts they dwell. They dwell in the gifts that kids bring with them. Okay, you don't have to teach them about imagination or instinct or emotions.
Right.
They come with those gifts. Let's use them. Let's seek them out and encourage those gifts, and then we're going to really blossom as a society. I think that's going to be the future.
Very well said. I'll leave you with this fun anecdote that will make you happy. I have two young daughters, and I was telling them excited that I'm interviewing Stevie Van Zandt. I showed them the book, and I said, there is no chance these two girls know who this guy is. And they say, yes, we know this guy. He's the guy from Christmas Chronicles too. Like apparently you actually were playing. You're playing in that. So you are transcending generations now. And I just want to thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for what you did, for what you do. For sharing your wisdom and for being truly a fun-loving person. It really comes through. So you made me laugh and you made me cry, and I appreciate it.
Good talking to you, Diego. and everybody.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
All right, my friend.
And the time has come to announce the winner for the sweepstakes for Stevie's signed guitar. Together, as part of the Give campaign, we were able to raise over $48,000 for Stevie's nonprofit TeachRock.org that supports students and teachers across the nations. Thank you for showing again the Microsoft giving spirit. And the lucky winner of today's sweepstakes is Thomas Snyder. Congratulations, Thomas. He's a senior service engineer from the Cloud Plus AI organization. Thank you, Thomas, and everyone else for contributing. And until the next Outside In.